So I have a bit of what might be a unpopular opinion when it comes to this series, and to kind of the full disclosure, I don't have any of the books, so I'm going to be using the movies as kind of like a visual aid as we go throughout this review here. So basically, this is going to be a book to movie comparison. So it's going to be a little bit different than my other book reviews, but it's predominantly going to be about the books and in the ways they differ from the movies, and some things that I like that one did that the other didn't do, and vice versa. So without further ado, we'll go from there. And a little side note, I read the first two books when I was in high school many years ago, and I acquired the third one. And so I don't have the actual books, and I don't have the third one anymore, but I'll get into why a little bit later on. So if you made it this far in the video, there are definitely spoilers ahead, so just be wary of that. So we're going to start with the first book movie called The Maze Runner. And it basically starts out, you have a character named Thomas, but he doesn't know that yet, who wakes up in this confined space of some sort that is basically skyrocketing upwards towards an unprecedented destination, if you will. Comes out into this world where there's a bunch of boys around his age, like teenage years from what I gather. They are all confined in this square-shaped area called the Glade. And that's kind of where they live. That's where they do their crops, build their structures. That's just where they do everyday life, trying to survive with the supplies that come out of the box once a month, which also brings a new person into the Glade once a month. And outside of the Glade, you have a maze, this whole labyrinth that changes every single night. And it's portrayed really well in the movie, I must say, when you hear the sounds of the maze changing at night when they're all sleeping in the glade. And I found that very fascinating. Which is another thing I want to get into. I really liked how the book translated into a movie. Like they missed some things, but they got it for the most part pretty close. And I found the film adaptation to be quite enjoyable. But back to the book, there's different groups of kids in the Glade that have different roles and responsibilities. You have the slicers, which basically tend to the meat. They handle preparing it to be cooked for food. You have the medjacks, who are basically like the medics of the group. And there's a few other roles that I can't remember, but one most notable in this series that is a constant theme throughout is the runners. And their job is to, every single day, when the doors that seal the glade off from the rest of the maze open each morning, they have to run out into the maze, and each runner has a different quadrant of the maze that is assigned to them that they have to explore and mentally map out in order to return back before the gates close at nightfall. They have to run into this little hut and basically sketch out the layout that they explored, and they do this every single day. As you go throughout the story, Thomas finally remembers his name. It's a process that all of the Gladers go through when they're new to the place. And Thomas is not satisfied with the situation as much as the rest of the Gladers are. He is questioning things more, and he's exploring in places that he probably shouldn't be quite yet compared to everybody else. But it's this initiative that kind of drives the events in the book later on. And he actually ends up out in the maze at nighttime and sealed off from the glade where it's safe. And that's when he encounters the monsters that they say roam the maze at night looking for victims. And these monsters are known as grievers. And they have a pretty complicated description. They are organic / mechanical type creatures, very cyborgy, if you will. And that's another amazing thing that the movie did. The creature design on the grievers is just incredible, and they're absolutely terrifying. Now, there's a little side note to the grievers. They have the ability to sting the gladers with this chemical, if you will. and it basically causes the glader that has been stung to go insane. But what they don't realize yet is that these gladers are not just acting insane because the chemicals making them insane. They are also remembering parts about their past life before entering the glade and the maze and all that, the world before all of that. And which makes the one stung trust Thomas a whole lot less, because Thomas was actually a part of this somehow, but we don't know how yet. And with Thomas kind of exploring out on his own and causing trouble, more things start to kind of go downhill for the Gladers. And some other details that I remember from the book is that the people that put them in this maze have a way of surveillancing them. And it's not like normal cameras. If I remember right, it was like some kind of lizard-like robot with a camera that would kind of run around and look at them whenever. And it had this word painted on it, wicked. And they weren't exactly sure what that was supposed to mean just yet. At some point or another, the box in the glade opens up a whole month early, because it's only supposed to come up, a month. They're like, what the heck's going on? They look in, and there's a girl in the box. And so the trust factor is just deteriorating more and more with Thomas, because she wakes up and she says this phrase, everything is going to change. And I also believe, if I remember the book correctly, I'm not sure if it was just in the movie, she said Thomas's name. And it seems whatever these people did to make people forget affects girls and boys differently. The boys can't remember their names at all, but she can remember her name and Thomas's. So everybody's just at this point trying to figure things out. Everybody has their own ideas of what's right and what's wrong and what they should do next, or if they should do anything next. Problems begin to spiral even more. So we learn more about the maze itself. The different quadrants, there's 8 different quadrants, I believe, of the maze that line up a certain way each night. The way it works is they take all of their sketches of each quadrant and lay them on top of each other. So you got a stack for each quadrant, and it forms a letter in the center of that quadrant. And so it creates a set of passwords that they need in order to escape. So they discover this area that is kind of sort of beyond the maze. And they only discover it because, for whatever reason, during the daytime, after Thomas becomes a full-fledged runner, is they see a griever during the daytime, and that's never happened before. In, 3 years was it they've been stuck inside this maze? They follow it to where the maze kind of opens up to this cliffside, or what looks like a cliffside, if you will. And all they can see is nothing but sky above, in front of them, and below them. But through experimentation, they notice that there is a portal of some sort that is a short distance away from the ledge. Like rocks would disappear into it and whatnot. And they were able to take vines and kind of toss it over into this portal to where they could locate its size and shape and how far exactly it went from the ledge. Keeping to how things get a little bit more detrimental, the doors stop closing at night, allowing the grievers to come into the glade and kill to their heart's content. So they some of them finally decide to leave the glade and see where this portal goes with the passwords, in tow, in order to see if they can finally escape this nightmare. Our group, you got Thomas, Teresa, Newt, and you have some other notable characters, Mino, that kind of become his centralized group of friends. I think Fry Pan was another one. I think Winston was another character. They hop through the portal, with some gladers staying behind in the glade because they just didn't want to leave for whatever their personal reasons may have been. Gally being one of them. That's a character that becomes more important later on. So they kind of go down this slide, if you will. They discover the room that the grievers come from. They also figure out a way to disable the grievers, and it's in this crazy fight and grapple with the grievers that they have to avoid the stingers and being crushed in order to kind of get behind the grievers, and they have this switch inside their blubber-like skin that they have to reach into and pull pretty much to kill them. So they're trying to do this while at the same time part of their group is trying to enter the passwords into this console that ultimately shuts down all the grievers. They realize they're actually in a much bigger facility, and that it's this organization called Wicked, which is the World in Catastrophe Kill Zone Experimental Department. And you learn through this character named Ava Page, who's kind of the leader of this organization, the mastermind behind it all, if you will. The purpose of Wicked is to find a cure for this virus that has ravaged the world. But before we get into that, it all started with the Earth being basically fried by solar flares from our sun. So the world is this desolate wasteland now, especially in the area of the globe between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn around the equator. That was the worst scorched area. That's a reference for later. And that was, if we didn't think that was bad enough, this virus emerged afterwards that is pretty much incurable. And it basically affects the brain of those that it affects. And it causes them to basically go insane. You also find Gally is with Ava Page at that time as well. He somehow got past them and he's with her. But you can tell that he is being mind controlled, if you will, because we also learned that the Gladers have these devices attached to their brains, give Thomas and Teresa in particular the ability to telepathically communicate with the side effect of a headache. And it also allows Wicked to track everything in all the Gladers, like their brain chemistry, their bodily vitals, and all this other stuff. It also allows them to track them physically. It also gives them the ability to control their actions as well, which is obviously very detrimental to our heroes here. There's also another character, probably the youngest of them all, named Chuck, and this is where he actually meets an unfortunate end by the hand of Gally, who I there again say is under the control of Wicked, and also appears to have been stung, if I remember correctly, or maybe that's just the movie. It seems it's at the direction of Ava Page, if I remember right, so she's this very ominous character who's this, the ends justify the means, etc., etc. But Gally ends up killing Chuck, and Thomas absolutely goes insane and starts wailing his face in, and which is pretty satisfying considering how much trouble the character Gally causes throughout the Maze Runner in the book. And if I remember how the book ends, they finally make it outside of the facility when this group of gunmen burst into the room and supposedly gun down Ava Page. And so the Gladers, they're rescued, and so they are escorted out of this facility. I think it was pouring rain. They're trying to get on this bus to head somewhere, not helicopters like in the movie. And that was another change that they went into the movie. It was a video message from Ava Page where you see her get gunned down, which was still a pretty, good enough choice, I thought. The way it was portrayed was still intense. And, you almost kind of feel bad the way Ava Page is portrayed in the movie, how everything seemed so hopeless to her, and they were just trying to save the human race, even though it was at the death of children, potentially. Which I know I'm not trying to justify her actions at all. No way, shape, or form am I trying to do that. But you can kind of see how she rationalized all these actions from a psychological standpoint. But in the movie, when they are rescued by the people and they're taken off in the helicopters, and you see the maze from a top view, an aerial view for the first time, they kind of end the movie with this cityscape, this desolate cityscape shot in this, what appears to be a desert. And one of the crew members says a phrase that you'll find familiar from the book and from earlier in this review. He says, "Everything is going to change," which is something that is repeated throughout. Just like something that Ava Page says, I believe, in the book and the movie, "Wicked is good." That is one that reappears prominently throughout the whole series. So the book and movie ends with them heading off to this, destination. They have no idea where they're going, but they effectively think that they are saved. But at the end of the book and at the end of the movie, see, in the book, it's shown in the form of an email, I believe it was, an email message from Ava Page to her associates of Wicked, as far as the maze trials were a success, and now we're going to move forward with the next set of trials. they seem to have taken the bait, and no one's thinking otherwise, etc., etc. Whereas in the movie, you physically see her walking through this meeting room with all these associates, and she's standing above them, and she's basically saying the same thing the email said, and she's wiping blood off of her face, from where she took her own life, if you will. So that's when you realize, like, oh, Wicked still has them, but they don't know it yet. So with that, I'm going to transition from the Maze Runner, and one thing I forgot to mention earlier on in the video, one thing I like that they did with the movie covers compared to the book covers is that they kind of followed the same theme, like the stone colors and the greens of the book cover for the Maze Runner translated into the movie cover. And for the second one here, the Scorch Trials, it followed a more deserty theme, which is very on topic. And the book cover kind of showed, a mountain range and some lightning and a desert below the mountain range, which is a really great way to showcase how the story is going to progress, in my opinion. So the Scorch Trials, you find, are gladers in this new facility, and they have bunks. They've finally been able to take showers for a change and eat pizza, which is something that they didn't have in the Glade. So it's all these commodities that they're finally getting to experience. At some point or another, things change. Teresa disappears, and in her place, they find this new boy in their group. It was Eris. I think that's what his name was. They have no idea where he came from or where Teresa went, but another person in this room is someone that will eventually become known as the Rat Man throughout the series because of how ugly he looks, pretty much. But his actual name is Jansen, and he's played by an incredible actor in the movie series, like an actor that prominently plays roles where you cannot figure out whether or not you can actually trust this guy. And he just does an excellent job with that type of role. And speaking of well-played roles, Dylan O'Brien portrays his version of Thomas perfect. I absolutely loved his portrayal of the character. Loved Dylan O'Brien and all the other stuff that he's in. But yeah, really incredible way he portrayed Thomas. So it's in this book where my unpopular opinion kind of comes into play. I hold the opinion, and I don't hold... This is crazy for me because I always consider the books to be better than the movies for the majority of the series that I read. But in this particular case, I think the movies are better than the books. But I'll get into that more so later on. They find the Rat Man in this room with them, but he's also kind of protected by a force field. And you learn that in this world there's a technology that exists that's called flat trans, and it's basically portaling technology. But you can only portal to the places where the flat trans actually exist and is installed. Think of it as walking through a TV and coming out of another TV somewhere else. You physically have to have the device there. They can't just portal wherever they desire. They are basically coerced into going on this journey by the Rat Man, who's also working underneath Ava Page. And I believe they learn she's still alive at that point. They have no choice but to, with this Eris kid, go through this flat trans after their meeting with the Rat Man, and they are immediately placed into this dark environment that ends up being a cave. And when they finally figure out a light source, they have already had one of their group get killed. And they couldn't figure out why, because they heard him scream, and then when they felt in the dark and found his body, they found his body, but realized his head was gone. And in its place, there was this metallic sphere on the ground. And when they finally get a light source, they discover these chandelier-type apparatuses in the cave. And they produce these liquid metal metallic spheres that then kind of zoom through the tunnel and attack them. And basically what it does, it latches on top of their heads and slowly melts and envelops their head until it decapitates them altogether and hardens into a solid metal, which is pretty insane if you ask me of a way to go. They were able to get it off of one of their characters, I think it was Winston, but it was molten metal, so he ends up getting severely burned in the top portion of his head. But they sprint to the end of this tunnel and emerge out into this massive deserty wasteland. and that's when they realized they have ventured into what is called the Scorch, that area I mentioned earlier between the Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn, the most scorched part of the Earth by the sun flares. They have to basically journey beyond these mountains that they can see in the distance within a span of, I think it was a few days, maybe a week. I can't really remember 100%, but they didn't have much time to basically cover the span of this desert, go through this city at the bottom of the mountain range. They had to then climb through the mountain range and come out on the other side where they are supposed to be picked up by Wicked on the deadline. And so they travel through the wasteland, end up getting chased into the city by this lightning storm, and all the while we're still not sure what the deal is with Teresa. She kind of reappears briefly for a moment there, but you can kind of sort of tell that she is under the control of Wicked. Obviously, a big difference from what all I've just told you, book to movie, is that in the movie, Wicked is actually harvesting the children. So you learn that there are certain children who are immune to the virus. And so in the book, Wicked is just simply studying them and their brain activity, seeing how they react to different situations, trying to figure out why the immune brain survives the virus, what makes it behave differently or react differently to the virus compared to the people who just go insane from the virus. And that's the whole purpose with the Maze trials and the Scorch trials. Whereas in the movie, they are literally harvesting this chemical from their brain, and the subjects don't survive. They're literally bled dry of this brain chemical of theirs. You learn in the movie that there was more than one different maze, but you don't learn that until the third book. And in fact, there was only 2 mazes in the book series, whereas there were several in the movie series. You also have this crazy grand escape from the Wicked facility where the kids run out on their own into the Scorch, and same thing. Only they're trying to get beyond this mountain range in order to intercept this group called the Right Arm, which is in opposition to Wicked and all that they're doing to these children, allegedly. You also encounter the Cranks, which are the people infected by the virus, but you encounter them at different stages of infection. But one thing I didn't 100% like going to the movie adaptation was the way the Cranks were portrayed. When they get to end stage, they are portrayed as these mindless zombies, if you will, with these growths coming out of them, which it honestly was a nice aesthetic choice, which was very scary and whatnot, but they kind of like made them animalistic, like they behaved off of instinct and reacted to their environment and were just mindless, if you will. Whereas in the book, it was kind of a step above that. They're portrayed more so as crazy people in the end stages. So they get to the city after being chased by this lightning storm, and they encounter 2 more characters. Brenda, it's in this place, they find these writings on the walls, like, Thomas, you're the real leader. They were placed there by Wicked, of course. Thomas, you're the real leader. Newt, who was kind of leading the group up to this point, sort of, kind of, being the glue of the operation, keeping everybody together. Basically, Thomas and Brenda get separated from our group because they have to tunnel down to make it through this city. Well, the Cranks apparently love scary, dark places. But they encounter this one particular Crank, and I love the way he's portrayed in the book. I wish he was in the movie. Who has basically clawed off or cut off his own nose. So he basically has this noseless face. It's like a hole in his face. And he's obsessed with cutting other people's noses off to replace the one that he removed. And like the way he spoke, it's creepy the way it's described, and I really enjoyed that part of the book. You get to the mountain range, Brenda and Thomas make it through, and at some point or another, you find out that there's also a group of girls from the second maze who are making this trek at the same time the boys are. And there's kind of some back and forth between those groups as well, as far as some pompousness, if you will, or conceitedness. Like the girls were like, oh, well, we escaped 3 days earlier than you guys did, and all that. But Teresa has been placed in their group, and Eris was the the boy that was in their group during the Maze trials, and they just basically switched places for the Scorch trials. At some point or another in the story, and this is kind of really where it diverges with my unpopular opinion, there's something that happens in the movie and there's something that happens in the book, and they are two totally different things, but both of them destroys Thomas's trust in Teresa. Now, one I thought was justified, but the other, not so much. In the movie, they end up making it through this mountain range to the other side and, intercepting the right arm, and they think they're safe and all this other stuff. And Teresa in the movie ends up betraying their location to Wicked because Wicked got a hold of her and removed her chip and basically restored her memories of what the world used to be before Wicked kind of took control. The chaos of everything and all the people that were dying from the virus and killing each other, etc., etc. And basically leads to a lot of people dying and getting captured by Wicked to be experimented on again, etc. Whereas, that seems pretty justified to no longer trust Teresa and to be kind of in aversion to her. Whereas in the book, she and Eris get Thomas alone, and you very obviously can tell that they are under the direction or possibly even under the control of Wicked during this, maybe even physically being controlled to do this. But you also learn that they were also coerced to do what they did to Thomas as well. So they basically apprehend Thomas and shove him into this room that's in the mountainside, and this glass door closes and separates them, and this gas comes out of the box. But nothing ends up happening. It's just, nothing. The gas is nothing. And the door opens, and Thomas reemerges out of this room to find both Teresa and Eris teary-eyed and apologetic and apologizing profusely, trying to say, it was Wicked, they made us do this, they said if we didn't do this, they would kill you. And this just kind of goes along with, presenting different situations to the kids and seeing how their brains react to situations and their brain activity being studied and all that. Thomas is basically, he's not having any of it at this point. And I can get they kind of sort of betrayed you, but at the same time, they were coerced. They were forced to do this, just like the rest of you were. And he basically has a problem with Teresa from that point on in the story all the way to the end of the trilogy. And quite honestly, Book Thomas after that point annoys the hell out of me. And I'm so glad they took a different direction with it in the movie, because I like Movie Thomas so much better than Book Thomas after that point. Because the things that Movie Thomas did were understandable from there on to the end of the series. Like, it made sense. It was more common sense based. Whereas, honestly, I don't know any other better way to put it. Book Thomas from that point on basically becomes a little bit. At the last second, right there on the deadline, they finally make it into the area that's supposed to be. And one thing I forgot to mention, you also learn that some people in the Gladers group were immune, but not all of them were. And honestly, I think Wicked intermixed that group to basically be able to tell the difference, see how the non-immune brain reacted to the same situations that the immune brain did. But they get to this kind of clearing, which is also deserty, and these coffins emerge from the sand. And this is something that I wish was in the movie as well, because I would have loved to have seen this creature design. These creatures emerge from these coffins, and they're like these humanoid creatures with these glass bulbs all over their skin. Very grotesque. And the Gladers and the group of girls and Brenda have to battle it out with these creatures, but they eventually figure out that the way to disable them is to smash these orbs that are all over their bodies. And it's right at the last second that this hovercraft appears to pick them all up. And that's when you run into the Rat Man again, Jansen, and he almost nearly tosses Brenda out of the ship because she wasn't supposed to be there. She was just, they just kind of sort of encountered her and her companion along the way. That's pretty much where the book and movie kind of lead off. So in the movie, they basically are not left in a good place. Wicked has kidnapped Mino. Teresa has gone willingly with them, and they've kind of gone along their way. So it kind of leaves them trying to figure out what their next move is. How are they going to move against Wicked? What's the next step? And they're all looking to Thomas for the answers. Thomas, you're the real leader. Whereas the book ends with them kind of, still in the captivity of Wicked and not knowing what's coming next. They're just being transported to yet another Wicked facility. That's pretty much where the book leaves off. And it also leaves off with yet another email from Ava to her associates and all that good stuff, where she basically recaps the events of the book and where they're going from there. But that eventually leads you into the Death Cure, which they're following the same color scheme of the book cover with the movie cover. They're in this facility, and this is where they finally find out who among their group is immune and who isn't, and that's where you discover that Newt, which is a very lovable, you fall in love with his character and you get very invested. You find out he's not immune, basically through their identification system. Now, they end up escaping this Wicked facility and getting out into the world, and they discover that there's actually several cities still somewhat intact across the globe. There's not a last city like there was in the movie. Things are a lot more dire in the movie, I gotta say. And the movie starts out with them trying to rescue Mino from this train, and then they end up going on this quest to find Minho to the last city, and they got to figure out a way into the city. Whereas in the book city, they go to one of these cities and they basically get scanned, and if you're immune, you can get in. If you're not, you can't get in. You also find out that Brenda and Jorge were actually immune employees of Wicked, but they're still on their side, and they're very instrumental in getting them out because Jorge can fly these hovercraft. So they go on these adventures, and they kind of learn about the state of the world in this city. Like, people are being apprehended as they're finding out, people being infected by the flare virus. It's just an absolute mess throughout this whole city. And you end up encountering, for the first time in the third book, the Right Arm, and you run into a familiar character, Gally, who is somehow alive, but no longer under the control of Wicked, but they're still kind of like wary, but he becomes a better, more tolerable character in the book and movie because he's no longer under the whims of Wicked. He's kind of doing his own thing now. And, in the movie, they encountered the same group, but in the second movie, they've already encountered the Right Arm. There's the obvious difference there. But you encounter the leader of the Right Arm in both the book and movie, and they're trying to figure out how to move against Wicked and how to take them down. And they end up getting entrance into the last city in the movie, and that's where Teresa and Ava and Wicked is kind of holed up, still trying to find a cure. Through a variety of circumstances in the book, Newt starts to become more and more far gone, and they actually end up in this other city that is specifically for cranks. And that's where you truly see people at the different stages of infection that haven't gone fully insane yet. And there's this gut-wrenching, or heart-wrenching rather, interaction where Newt forces Thomas and the group to part ways with him because you can see him starting to falter and to lose his sanity. And so he doesn't want to do anything to his friends, so he goes off on his own into this, this crank city, if you will. And our group has to leave him behind, whereas in the movie, he becomes full zombie and tries to kill Thomas and ends up getting killed himself. Some obvious differences. Everybody in the book is fully immune, but in the movie, there's different levels of immunity, which is why it's been so hard to find a cure. So the serum that they get from the immune in the movie, if it comes from some, it can only prolong the infection. It can only mitigate it. It doesn't fully cure it. And you still suffer some side effects like the growths coming out of your face and things like that. Whereas literally the only thing that makes Thomas special in the books, because Wicked finally narrows it down to him and Teresa, and that their brains are different from even that of the others, but they finally single out Thomas as the sole subject that they need to study and operate on, be mainly just for the simple difference that he's more of a free thinker than Teresa, where she's more of a rule follower. And so Thomas willingly gives himself over to Wicked and basically submits to letting his brain be operated on in order to find a cure for the flare virus. And the rest of his group are on a little secret mission. They find out that it's this facility that Thomas is being kept in that the two mazes side by side are located. The one that had the boys in it and the one that had the girls in it. And so they mount this rescue mission to go and save all the immune people that are being held captive in the maze. And so all that's going on while the right arm itself is bombing the Wicked facility piece by piece. And so it becomes this mad dash to kind of get everybody corralled into this one location. And it's there that things come to a head with the Rat Man. That's when you discover that he's infected with the flare. So in the movie, they mount a rescue mission, yes, for people held in the Wicked facility, but the maze is not incorporated into that at all. You learn in the movie that Thomas is the prime subject because his brain doesn't just fight off the flare virus like all the other immunes, it actually destroys it entirely. And so anyone that gets serum from his body, they can be cured entirely. He also willingly submits himself to Wicked for that, but in the process, Ava Page gets killed in the movie by the Rat Man. You find out he's infected, just like Newt was infected, and this whole brawl ensues between them. And at the same time, you have the right arm and the cranks and whatnot bombing the city and slowly inching closer and closer to the Wicked facility until ultimately everybody ends up in the same location. Now in the movie, they're bombing the Wicked facility and Teresa just barely throws Thomas into the hovercraft at the top of the skyscrapers in order to get him out of there, and she basically falls with the building. Whereas in the book, they're running through this Wicked facility trying to get to this flat transportal to, get the hell out of there because they can't get the right arm. They can't reason with the right arm to get them to stop bombing while they can get everybody out, to safety. At the last second, Thomas is pushed out of the way by Teresa by the falling rubble and is in turn crushed. But you don't really have time to process that because the place is still collapsing and they have to run through this portal. So in the movie, Thomas basically goes unconscious and wakes up on this island where the Gladers and everybody they've rescued have come together into this, I don't want to use the word utopia or paradise because it's still a broken world, but they've kind of found their own little area of safety where they can kind of rebuild their own civilization and move on from there. It was a little bit of a send-off for a lot of the character deaths and whatnot, and you get a little goodbye message from Newt, of course. The movie ended pretty good, and Thomas still has a vial of his cure in play, and it's not being used for anything. But it had a good solid ending to the movie. Whereas in the book, again, this is more, to me, greatly disliking Book Thomas, because you spend like the first half of the series with him kind of developing this connection or semi-romance with Teresa. Then that betrayal happens and Brenda comes into the picture, and Brenda ends up destroying the flat trans portal that led them to this area at the end of the book that seems to be largely unaffected by all the devastation, if you will. The problem I have with the ending of the book is that Thomas seems to move on incredibly quick after she destroys this flat trans to ensure that Wicked could never find them again. He moves on really fast from Teresa's death and is already making out with Brenda by the end of the story there. And I believe that's literally how that scene is closed out. And it's like, I don't know, it really annoyed me, like the way that was handled. Whereas it's a little more sad in the movies and a little more heartfelt and emotional. But like with all the books, the ending of The Death Cure is with a email from Ava Page, and you learned that at some point or another, Ava in the book decided to abandon her search for a cure altogether, and in the background, she was setting up this place for all of the immunes to go to live separate from the rest of the world, because the world was pretty much unsavable at that point. The operation on Thomas didn't go through because the Right Arm started bombing the place, so that was kind of like their last step, if you will, their final straw. And so they end up sending them to this undisclosed location where they can build a society of their own of immune people, and a new world could hopefully be made from them by them. And yeah, you kind of learn that Ava was, in a way, on their side the whole time, and she is going to basically sacrifice herself with the rest of the world as it hopefully dies out with everyone being infected with the virus and all that, so that the immunes can hopefully at some point, I believe, take the world back. Salvage what's left. So that pretty much concludes my review. I think at least halfway through, the movies, especially Movie Thomas, are better than the book versions because of just how the events played out and Thomas, the way he reacted to certain things. And I know it might be an unpopular opinion, but that's my opinion, and that's just the way I feel about it. But outside of that, at least the first half of the book series was super enjoyable to read from just the mystery level, alone. Trying to figure out everything and what this world is and what it means. But I highly recommend watching the movies, especially, and if you're feeling froggy, you can read the books too. But yeah, definitely give the movies a watch. They were excellently done, excellently portrayed, and the CGI is absolutely incredible throughout. They did an excellent job on this. You won't be disappointed after watching these movies, I can promise you that. So that's all I've got. I got another book review planned here shortly from a series that I just recently finished. I'm kind of excited about that one because it was one that surprised me, especially by the end of it. But if you have any suggestions, feel free to leave a comment on some book series that I should read. I still got quite a bit to go through, but I'll be happy to read through any suggestions and potentially do book reviews on those as well. But until then, see you guys for the next book review.